I'm Alice Park, National Health Correspondent for Time. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Collins, thank you for joining us for this Time 100 Talks.
Nice to talk to you again, Alice.
It looks like you're at home, social distancing, but you run a $42 billion biomedical research facility. How do you do that remotely, and what does your typical day look like?
When we all felt we had to shelter at home back in March, I really wondered how this could possibly work, but it actually has worked pretty well. I've spent most of the last 15 weeks right here in this space, my home office, at a rather small space with a desk that's got an awful lot on it because nobody's here to help me file stuff. But, between what one can do with all kinds of technologies, particularly things like WebEx and Zoom, and all kinds of phone calls that are happening very spontaneously and suddenly, and not having to spend a lot of time on travel, which normally would have been a big time sink, it's actually possible to get an awful lot done. And that's what we need right now, given the COVID-19 crisis. I don't think I've ever worked harder. I did add up the number of hours I spent last week, and it came to just about exactly 100. And that's been the kind of drill that I've been in the middle of ever since March, as we're trying to do everything we can to accelerate research that will bring an end to this terrible crisis.
And I know that NIH is very directly involved in developing a vaccine for COVID-19, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to ask about how does that work as far as the people who are now coming into the labs, people who have experiments ongoing and who are working on the vaccine. How many people, what part of the staff is coming in, and how is that worked out?
So we decided for the staff safety back in March that we would ask everybody to work from home who didn't absolutely have to be there to work on COVID-19 research or who were involved in patient care. We also run a research hospital, the largest one in the world, and obviously we need to take care of our patients. So that meant the total census on our campus in Bethesda shrank back by about 80%. We're down about 20% of the usual level of folks. It was pretty impressive how many of those folks continued to work very effectively from home. Our entire grants administration process just kept humming right along. But certainly scientists who weren't working on COVID-19 and needed a bench in order to do their work were kind of frustrated. 2 weeks ago, we did let some of those scientists very carefully come back to campus because at the moment, the spread of the virus in our local community is at a pretty low level. We're watching that very carefully. Everybody on campus is required to wear a mask and they get sent home if they're not. And we're being very careful about physical distancing. And so far, we have not had a single example where we believe the cases happened where the virus was spread at the workplace. Although we have certainly had staff members who've gotten infected by things they're doing at home or in the community. So I think we're doing this about the right way, but it's been very frustrating. And we certainly lost a lot of momentum on research that wasn't directly related to COVID. Everybody working on the virus, as in the Vaccine Research Center, they've been there at full staff, although being very careful about distancing and working night and day to move this forward. But if you were working on cancer immunotherapy, things had to slow down in order to keep people safe.
Are you concerned about what impact that slowing down will have on research, and what areas of research are you particularly worried about?
I'm worried about a lot of them. Again, keep in mind NIH's resources primarily are not spent in our own facilities. They go out to all those universities across the country and some outside the country that receive their grants from us because they come forward with their ideas and we put them through rigorous peer review. And most of those universities have also had to send people home for safety reasons. So we have lost momentum over the last 3 or 4 months in almost every area of research that's not directly related to the virus. Certainly clinical trials have had to slow down because people have been reluctant to show up in a clinic or a hospital to enroll in a trial unless it was absolutely life-threatening. So no question about it. Of the many consequences of COVID-19, one of them has been a slowdown in research that was on almost anything except the virus.
We've heard a lot about the importance about being prepared for a pandemic like this and investing in research before they hit in order to minimize their impact. How do you sustain the level of commitment to research on pandemic preparedness when cases start to wane?
This comes up every time there is a pandemic, whether it's HIV or whether it's the latest influenza H1N1 or whether it's SARS or MERS or Ebola or Zika. All of those are epidemics that have happened in my own lifetime. And always there is this sense when things start to get a little better, okay, this time we're going to maintain our readiness. We're going to be prepared for the next one. And some of that has happened. Don't let me downplay the fact that we have learned with each one of those some pretty interesting and useful things that made it easier the next time around. I mean, take, for instance, the vaccine that is furthest along right now for COVID-19. It was built upon experience trying to make a similar vaccine for SARS and MERS, and now with a different coronavirus, knowing exactly what steps to take, which is why it got going so quickly. But I think it's also fair to say that we could have been in a better place if we'd been fully expecting this kind of global pandemic. And maybe this time, because this has been the worst global pandemic in the lifetime of any of us, it's been more than 100 years since we had one that hit this hard, maybe we will learn the lessons a little better and we'll sort of avoid sinking back into complacency in 21 and 22, and we'll actually make sure we sustain our preparedness.
As director of the NIH, is there anything you can do to make sure that we don't slip back into that sense of complacency?
Well, one of my jobs is to answer questions from the Congress and the administration about exactly where we should be investing medical research dollars. Already these conversations are coming up. I had a recent Senate hearing where Senator Alexander really wanted to talk about this in terms of what the Congress should be thinking about for future budget allocations. And he made it very clear that he felt that this was a lesson that we must not forget. And as we make plans for the coming years, figure out exactly what kind of sustainability is needed and then make sure that that's supported. And I'm totally there. And so when I get the chance in that circumstance to answer such questions, I am glad to do so. I'm a little bit in a funny position as part of the executive branch. I'm not allowed to lobby the Congress. That would be a bad thing. But I can answer their questions if they want me to provide information. So I'm always glad to be asked.
Let's talk about NIH's role in developing the COVID-19 vaccines. In April, you announced a partnership with 16 pharmaceutical companies, called it the Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines, or ACTIV.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that partnership and what its mission is?
It has been an amazing experience having all of these partners come together in basically sort of with 2 weeks' notice and get started on April 17th with an incredibly broad and bold agenda. And it's now up to 18 companies, as well as multiple parts of the federal government, NIH, CDC, FDA, the BARDA folks who have a lot of the resources for this. All of this managed nicely by the Foundation for NIH, the Veterans Administration, the Department of Defense, all at the table as well. And we basically said, what are the things that most need to be done? What are the priorities? How can we do this together faster than if we went at it separately? And that meant identifying what are the highest priority therapeutic options that we should be getting into clinical trials right now. And how do we do the best we can with the vaccines to organize those trials so that they're done in a way that you can interpret the results, so that there's a similar protocol for each vaccine so you can do comparisons. What you'd call a master protocol needed to be developed. Most of those things are things that would take 6, 8, 12 months. Many of them were done in the space of 2 or 3 weeks. And with people working 24/7 from all of these sectors and not really worrying too much about who got the credit, we just had to get it done. Lives are at stake. When people write about the COVID-19 experience, I think there'll be a whole chapter about the ACTIV partnership as an unprecedented experience of everybody getting together to get the job done.
So would you say that that's something that sets this response apart from previous ones as far as developing potential therapeutics and vaccines? We just haven't seen that level of collaboration, right, between different sectors against a public health threat like this.
We've not seen this level of collaboration, that's for sure. I mean, take it when we first started with ACTIV and everybody was clamoring to try some new treatment that might help people who are sick in the hospital with COVID-19. You made a list of all of the ideas that were out there. There were more than 400 of them. You can't possibly run clinical trials on 400 different compounds. So you have to decide which ones are most important. And that means an expert group getting together, looking at all the data with great careful scrutiny, and then setting a list of priorities and saying, these are the ones that need to go first. That would be impossible if any single group decided to do that, because somebody else would disagree. But when you get everybody around the table and you agree on the rules of how you're going to do the priority setting, and then you come out with the top list, that's the top list. And that's what has now gone into the next set of therapeutic trials, trying to find, on top of remdesivir, which does provide benefit, and dexamethasone, which does provide benefit, what else do we need? And what about those monoclonal antibodies that are coming along? And how do we make sure those get tested in an appropriate protocol? Another example, until now, we had all of these networks that do clinical trials for lots of different conditions. But we didn't really have an inventory to know where they were, how quickly they could get in gear if they were given a charge to run a trial for COVID-19. And not just NIH's networks, but the ones that are funded by other organizations or by industry. Now we have that. We really know what our ability is, our capacity for running clinical trials. And so we can, when we have an exciting opportunity for a new antiviral that needs to be tested right away, do the matchmaking, find the network that's best situated to be able to take that on board and run the trial as quickly as possible. Never had that before. In this case, I guess the global pandemic has inspired us to do things that maybe we should have done before but didn't have sufficient motivation. Here again is something I hope we don't let that crumble after we get through this. That's a resource you'd want to have going forward, and we'll make sure we do.
And one of the benefits of that clearly is the speed with which we're seeing the vaccine trials get up and running, and some of the therapeutics come out and receive sort of preliminary green light from the Food and Drug Administration. The NIH has also played a role in Operation Warp Speed, the White House's program for speeding up development of COVID-19 vaccines. But both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redfield, who heads up the Centers for Disease Control, aren't totally fond of the name, because they fear that it implies, quality might be sacrificed for the sake of speed. Do you share their misgivings about that?
I do share their sense that maybe warp speed conveys a sense of going so fast that you're not being careful. Believe me, that is not the answer. I don't think you'd be on the Starship Enterprise and going into warp speed if you thought your ship was about to blow up either. So we are being really careful about the safety issues. But I'd rather be doing Operation Warp Speed than Operation Slow Boat. I mean, we're in a hurry here. People are waiting for these answers. So the idea that we are not going to do things in the business as usual mode is exactly what needs to happen. But the point that people need to understand, and I hope this is coming across, is that the way in which this is going so fast is not about compromising the rigor of those definitive trials that are going to tell you whether a vaccine works or it doesn't. It's about skipping some of those bureaucratic steps or the long delays in between phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials that normally consume months or even years, and figuring out how to plan so carefully that there are no gaps, no wasted times in between. Another big part of it, of course, is the concern that in the past, if you ran a trial for a vaccine and it worked, and then everybody wanted it, you had months of time where you would have to set up a facility to manufacture the millions of doses that you need. We're not going to have that time. So in this instance, the government is paying for vaccine doses in the tens of millions to be prepared even before we know which of the vaccines is going to work. And many of them may have to be thrown out because that vaccine didn't pay off. But for the ones that did work, we're ready. And it won't be that long, painful delay where you know you've got something that could help people, but you're not quite there yet. This has never quite been done before either, this sort of at-risk manufacturing. But it's not at risk to people's safety. It's at risk to the government's money that we're talking about.
Do you share Dr. Fauci's cautious optimism that we may have a vaccine, perhaps at least for high-risk groups like healthcare workers, by the end of the year?
I do share that cautious optimism, and I think that's the right way to describe it. When you look at the data of what is being generated in terms of these various vaccines, the first one of which will get into its phase 3 trial in a couple of weeks, it looks really good. These are vaccines that have been developed by various scientific approaches. So there's a diversity in the kinds of approaches that are being used, which is good. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Their phase 1 data, to the degree that that's been developed and that I've been able to see it, looks really encouraging that these are vaccines that generate strong antibody responses that you would predict would be protective. And now we're going to get out there in the real world and see what happens. And given that it's not just one, but it's as many as 4, 5, 6, or even 7 vaccines that are going into this pipeline, the chances that at least one of them, and maybe several of them, are going to work looks pretty darn good. So we are on record, I guess, all of us working on the vaccine effort, with cautious optimism, aiming to have at least one of these reach the point of FDA approval and to have 100 million doses ready to distribute by the very end of 2020, which is pretty darn soon. So that will break all possible records for the development of a vaccine against a new pathogen. But I think that's what we're called to do.
To get to this point where we have those vaccine candidates now being tested in people, a group of scientists at NIH did a review of 50 candidate vaccines. And what were the criteria to decide which ones to sort of recommend for fast track development?
You would want those criteria to include the science behind them. Is this likely to be something that has a good chance of working based on previous experience with other vaccines and other pathogens? So does it have a good scientific basis? Is it likely to be safe? Are you doing something that might have a risk? So for instance, at the moment, we have shied away from so-called killed virus vaccines because killing the virus means you better really be sure you killed it. And if there's a little bit of live virus left behind, you could actually cause the disease instead of preventing it. We are being very cautious about that. The vaccines that we're talking about here all take a tack which absolutely could not cause the disease, but basically produces a snippet of the protein coat of the virus that the body recognizes and raises an immune response to. And then you have to think about, is it practical? Could you actually get this done on the timetable we're talking about? That is, we've got to do this in a few months, not a few years. And then would there be a problem scaling it up? Some of the vaccines are really hard to make doses, and we're going to need hundreds of millions, if not billions, of doses of this for the whole world. So if you've got an approach that simply can't do that, maybe you'd better invest in a different option. And all of those things factored into the prioritization that we're now working with. And
that review hasn't been made public. Why not?
It's in a certain level, it's still a bit of a work in progress because new ideas are coming along. But a very practical reason is, I mentioned earlier, this investment by the government in doing at-risk manufacturing. So for the vaccines that are going to go forward, we want to be sure that is going to happen. That means there's negotiation going on with the companies that have those vaccines about how that contract ought to be written, which would include making sure that the American people have access to the doses if the vaccine happens to succeed. And it's not a good idea to talk publicly about something that's in the middle of a sensitive billion-dollar negotiation. That's the main reason why we haven't yet been as transparent. It will be coming soon.
And President Trump has recently said that he wants to stop funding the World Health Organization. What impact will that have on the health of not just Americans, but people around the world?
Well, science has always been an international enterprise, and certainly vaccine science is that way as well. All of us who've worked in this field do depend upon interactions with our international colleagues, and WHO has often been the convener of those kinds of conversations. CDC still has individuals who are situated in Geneva in order to be sure those linkages are happening. We need to do that. This is a global pandemic that's going to affect lots of other parts of the world and not just ours. So we'll continue to work in collaboration with WHO, even though the White House has decided they don't wish to continue to distribute funds in their direction.
So how will that work? Will that have to be individual researchers at NIH working with groups affiliated with WHO?
Indeed, and partnerships about science that have been going on a long time and for which we believe there's a great deal of value. And we'll try to continue that collaborative relationship in order to advance the cause of finding answers to this illness and to others as well.
And in retrospect, if you look back at the NIH's response to the pandemic, were there things that you wish you could have done differently or would have done differently given a second chance?
Oh, it's always easy to do that. I wish we had known earlier that this was a virus that could be passed on by asymptomatic people. It took a while to figure that out, and it was very controversial for a couple of months. And clearly our public health measures, like the insistence that everybody should be wearing a mask, was very much influenced by the ultimate realization that this was a virus unlike any other, that it really was possible for people who felt just fine to be carrying it and distributing it to others in their vicinity. If we had known that in January, I think we would have had a different approach to recommendations about mask wearing and social distancing. We just didn't have that scientific data. And of course, everybody would say, I wish, and they wish, and we all wish that the testing capacity had been available almost immediately with quick results to find out who's infected and get them isolated so that this wouldn't distribute to other people. That was a bit of a bumpy road, and it's still a bumpy road at this point, even though now testing is out there in great numbers. That's the good news. The turnaround time in the United States for getting test results back is still unacceptably long. You want somebody to know the answer as soon as possible. That, by the way, is the reason why NIH is now deeply engaged in another project relating to COVID-19, not about therapeutics, not about vaccines, but about diagnostics. And this program called RADx, which stands for Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics, is pushing forward in an unprecedented way to get small businesses who have developed very creative diagnostic ideas to quickly come into our Shark Tank, get their ideas tested, expand them, and get them out there where they're needed, particularly tests that can be done in what you call point of care, so you get the answer right then. And if somebody's infected, you immediately know they need to be isolated, as opposed to turning them loose for another few days, during which time they might actually be infecting others. So yeah, on top of everything else, I am consumed by the urgency of getting these diagnostic tests developed and distributed.
One of the unusual aspects of this particular pandemic is the clash almost from the beginning between our political leadership, the administration, and scientists. And we're seeing that continue to play out even today, 6 months into the pandemic. You've worked under various presidents. Has this administration been more difficult than most or more challenging than most when it comes to having the science heard and making sure that the right messages go out to the public about protecting their health?
Well, there's no question the public is getting a lot of different messages from different sources. It's not helping, I guess, that social media tends to amplify some of the wildest claims and often doesn't pay attention to the ones that are based on evidence. Yes, I have worked in the government now for 27 years. I had the experience of leading the Human Genome Project, which had its own moments of being contentious and controversial, and on beyond that in many other circumstances as well. And I think it is a very unfortunate situation when medical research becomes politicized. Unfortunately, for most of my time, that has not been the case, but there have been certainly some exceptions. I think our country right now, unfortunately, is polarized on almost everything. And so even this situation where the data is very clear about what we know and what we don't know tends to have a political spin attached to it in most of the conversations you hear in the media or coming from the Congress or the administration. My goal is to try to sort of push through all of that. Tony Fauci's goal, and he is a remarkably effective spokesperson for the truth of what's really going on. And as one of my institute directors, he reports to me, so I can say with great confidence that I am fortunate in having such a leader. That's all we can do as scientists, is to try to keep telling exactly what the facts say as often and to as many audiences as possible, which is why I'm glad I can talk to you today.
Well, Dr. Collins, before we wrap up, I have to ask, I know you're a pretty good guitar player and you play with your band, the Affordable Rock and Roll Act. Have you had time to play, and what songs are getting you through the pandemic?
It's very sad because all of our band gigs got canceled. The rock and rollers have not been able to jam now since March, and we are really missing that. And anybody who's part of some kind of musical group would agree with that. So yeah, I'm occasionally pulling out my guitar and playing a little solo number, or going to the piano, which is often a way that I sort of get through the day when it's getting a little overwhelming. But the group thing, not so much. My chief of staff has been rewriting lyrics to all kinds of familiar songs to make them appropriate for COVID. So I've got quite a songbook ready when the time comes. Things like Taking the Sound of Silence, the Simon and Garfunkel piece, where the first line now starts out, "Hello, Fauci, my old friend," and it goes on from there. Many things. I actually did a little video, which somehow went a little bit viral, rewriting the words to John Lennon's song called Imagine. Imagine there's a vaccine and it's ready for us all. Yeah, you got to laugh or you'll cry.
Well, we look forward to that songbook and when you get to play again with your band. Thank you, Dr. Collins, for sharing your insights on the pandemic and for giving us a glimpse into NIH's role in protecting the nation's public health.
Thanks, Alice. It's been great to talk to you.